All right, so over the last few weeks, we've been in a series that we're calling Identity, where we've been looking at how to live out a biblical view of you, of our identity, of our acceptance, of all the things that Scripture tells us that we are. If you've been around church at all, you can probably pick out those verses and those promises where Scripture talks about who you are and how valuable you are. But in everyday life, sometimes it can be really hard to remember those things. Well, today we're going to wrap things up as Jeremy talks to us about our new name. And if we're going to be living a life where we are called by our new name, we've got to stop living our old life where we're being called by our old name. So why don't we join Jeremy for part 5 of our series, Identity.
I always called her Grandma Hawes. Now, she wasn't actually my grandma. She was actually my great-grandma. And when she passed away a handful of years back, a wonderful, special lady, she was almost 102 years old. Now, she was the glue that held our family together, by all means, the matriarch. She was the reason we all gathered. She was the filter through which we passed all the decisions. She was the first person that we all thought of in our family. Her name wasn't Grandma Hawes to everybody. To some people in our family, 9 kids, they called her Mama. And Mama was important to her kids. She valued them, but her name wasn't Grandma Hawes and her name wasn't Mama. In the community, she was known as Miss Hawes, right? I mean, there was an air of respect when you spoke of Miss Hawes or Grandma Hawes or Mama, because everybody looked up to her. Her name wasn't Grandma Hawes, and her name wasn't Mama, and her name wasn't Miss Hawes. Her name, her given name, was a weird one. I got to be honest with you. I mean, she's my grandma, and I love her, but her name was different, right? It's not a name that you've likely named your kids. My guess is you've never even heard this name. Her name was Armintha. Armintha is an interesting and unique name. Maybe in 1911 that was a normal name. It's by no means a normal name today. But that name has a meaning. It has a meaning. I looked it up because I was curious. What does Armintha mean? Armintha means prayer and protection. Now, I don't know if Grandma Hawes knew that name. I don't know if she knew the meaning behind it or if she'd ever looked it up or had someone tell her that her name meant prayer and protection. But I do know this. She lived up to her name, whether she knew about it or not. She was clearly a woman who walked with Jesus, who cared about her family, and would do whatever it took to protect her. You never wanted to be on the end of her crooked little pointer finger telling you what to do, because you knew full well that she meant business and that she would do whatever it took to protect you and to protect the rest of the family that she loved. She lived up to her name even if she didn't know what it meant. What's your name mean? Do you have a story behind your name? Is it a family name? Your mom, your grandma, your grandpa, or somebody down your family line was named who you are named? It's crazy. My name has a story. I didn't really think about it. Most days it goes by without ever entering my mind, except for this, that my story, the story of my name is kind of embedded inside of it. It's not a meaning like your name means this. It has a story behind it. My parents went to a church that was really, really conservative. So conservative that they wouldn't use other versions of the Bible other than the King James Version. If you've ever heard a version of the Bible that had lots of these and thous and begats and hard, kind of difficult, not current language, then you've probably been reading the King James Version of the Bible. It's not one we use all the time, especially around Journey, because sometimes the words kind of get in the way of understanding the meaning, and the meaning is what's most important. But this particular version usually chooses the more difficult pronunciation, the more formal sounding words. But there's this one time in Matthew chapter 2 where the story uses a different name. And here's what's interesting about it. It's the Christmas story, and it says this, and I'm going to have to use my phone because it's not a Bible I usually use. It says this in verse 17. Then was fulfilled that which was spoken by Jeremy the prophet, saying. Now, it's not important as much what he says, but that's where my name came from. My parents named me after the prophet Jeremiah, who for some weird reason in this one verse is referred to as Jeremy the prophet. Weird. My middle name is Donald, Jeremy Donald Brown. My middle name is a big story behind it. My uncle was named Donald. My grandfather on my mom's side was named Donald. It's a family name, but it also had another significance. They had a family, a pastor in that church that I grew up in. This name was Donald McClintock, and he was huge to my parents. He was not just a big part of their life. He was a mentor, a pastor, a guy who cared about them, taught them a lot about God's word. So they named me Jeremy, after the prophet, and Donald after my uncle, my grandfather, and this pastor that cared about them. Now, my dad joked around when I was a kid. He said that he'd always named me after the prophet and the duck. But really, my name story is much deeper. But you know what, to be honest with you, I don't identify as much with Jeremiah the prophet. Never really think much about him. To be honest with you, Jeremiah was the weeping prophet. He never had a convert. So I don't know that I really want to have that kind of connection. But here's the other part of it. I think about my family name, but most importantly, what matters to me about my name is that my parents believed in me, named me after a prophet, a valuable family member, a great pastor. They believed in me before they even really knew me. And that's important. When I look through the Bible, I see that names meant something to God. Like, they were a big deal in the Bible. There's this guy named Abram who was just a follower of God, but he was 99 years old when God came to him and told him that he was going to be the father of a great nation. Abram's response was like, what, are you crazy? I mean, I'm 99 years old. My wife's old. We haven't had any kids. My wife is barren. Now, you got to get for 1 second how important that is. Because for a woman to be barren meant she was largely useless to that culture. For a man to not have kids meant he was largely useless to that culture. Their heritage, their value was really their lineage. And God came to him and said, hey, I know you're old, but here's the deal. You're going to be the father to a great nation. And Abram didn't believe God because he looked at his circumstances, the things around him, and he saw, man, there's no way that this could happen. But God believed for Abraham what Abraham could not believe for himself. In fact, God changed Abram's name to Abraham. He changed Sarai, his wife's name, to Sarah because God believed for Abraham what he couldn't believe for himself. There's another story where Gideon was a messenger of God. He was a prophet. And prophets are usually known as courageous men. But there's this one particular story where Gideon was hiding out in a wine press. We talked about this in a series not too far back. But he's hiding in a wine press because the Midianites are systematically stealing from the Israelites. This group of people were constantly stealing things, and he's hiding out in a wine press, threshing out wheat, barely just trying to eke out a little bit of food for his family, when God comes to him and says to him that you are a mighty warrior. Gideon's like, you got to be crazy, man. I'm hiding out in a wine press. I don't feel mighty. I don't feel like a warrior. I'm a coward. I'm hiding out here. But God believed for Gideon what Gideon couldn't believe for himself. Gideon looked in his mirror like Abram looked at his surroundings. And he thought, man, there's no way that I could be this mighty warrior. When he looked in the mirror, he saw a coward. When God looked at Gideon, he saw a mighty warrior. Names are significant to God. In fact, in David's story, maybe you're familiar with David, great king, David and Goliath, all the great things, great warrior reputation. But God saw something in David that David didn't see in himself. Because David got to a place when he was king where he was up on a roof and he looked over and he saw a woman bathing on top of another roof. And he said he sent over for her to be brought to him. And they had sex and she got pregnant. And then he tried to cover up the pregnancy by having her husband come home and visit. Maybe that will kind of work out so that he'll think it's his. But when that didn't work out, David did what was next logical for him. He had her husband killed in battle. David was an adulterer. David was a murderer. David felt all that grief because of his past. And when God said that David was a man after God's own heart, man, David didn't believe that. David had struggles believing that he was a man after God's own heart, but God believed it for David even when David couldn't believe it for himself. Abram looked at his circumstances and said, I'm old. I can't believe that I'd be the father of nation. Like Gideon looked at in the mirror and saw that he was a coward, and God, he didn't believe that he was the mighty warrior. David looked at his past and he couldn't believe he was a man after God's own heart. Your name is not the name that you've just been given. I've learned this over this series, that your name is not just the name that you've been given. More importantly, your real name is the name that you answer to. It's the name that you respond to when you hear it or feel it. I told you last week about me being bullied when I was a kid, and it's not an easy story for me to talk about, but it is important. It's embarrassing to me because where it all started is even more embarrassing than just being bullied. It all started in the 7th grade on a school bus. Now, this was the 80s, back before we cared about kids and we protected them from stuff. This was back in the day, right? And I was on this school bus, and I remember it like it was yesterday. This girl named Shawnee was picking on me. And it's a girl, so I'm stuck in this problem, right? She's picking on me, and I'm just trying to ignore it. But then she starts punching me over and over and over again in the face. And I'm stuck, this 12-year-old kid on a school bus with a decision that's impossible to make. If I fight back, I'm the guy who beat up a girl. If I don't fight back, I'm the guy who got beat up by a girl. This isn't good, right? And it's bad getting worse. She's punching me over and over and in the face, and I'm just trying to take it and just not bother with it at all. She backs up, and she says a word that stuck with me forever. She looks at me with everybody looking on, and she said, "You are such a goober." Isn't that the most ridiculous name to ever give somebody? I mean, I look back and I go, she could have found much, much better names. I don't know where she picked it. I don't know why it stuck. And to be honest with you, I don't know why it hurts so much. Because when I say it out loud, I go, what a stupid name. What a dumb kid. Why did I not just laugh and go, that's all you can come up with? But I didn't. And the name stuck. It stuck so much that it became the name I was known by all over. When I heard somebody say goob or goober, I knew exactly who they were talking about. This is so embarrassing to talk about, but so painful. But over and over again, it became the name that I heard, the name that I constantly responded to, and that was the problem. One day I met a girl named Amy, and she was after some after-school function, probably detention if I remember right, and she said, "What's your real name?" And I'm like, "What do you mean, what's my real name? You know me, just been in detention with you, I've been in class with you, you know my name." And she's like, "Well, I don't really know your real name." And I'm like, "Well, my name's Jeremy." She goes, "I really only knew you as Goober." And that was terrible, but the problem wasn't that Amy knew me as Goober, wasn't that Shawnee called me that or that other kids responded to it. The danger is when you and I answer to a name that's not true of us. And we all do it. The danger happens when you and I answer to a name, maybe one we're called, or maybe one that just resounds up inside of us, that's not true of us. I want to tell you a story. Last week I had an opportunity to tell you Kristen's story about how she found healing from codependency. Can I just tell you another story about a person who sits in the seats with you here at Journey every weekend? Her name is Lauren. And Lauren's story, like many of ours, is riddled with pain and disappointment from trauma that she experienced early in childhood. Hers was from a babysitter who was physically abusive when she was as young as 2 or 3 years old. She was made to take medicine that she didn't need and forced to stand in a cold shower when she wouldn't be quiet. She learned very quickly to answer to the feeling of misery. When she was in middle school, she was sexually abused by a teacher. And even after he admitted what he did and had to serve 12 years in prison, she carried the deep wound and learned to answer to names like dirty and useless, bad and undeserving. As a result, she feels like the only thing that she deserved was to be miserable. And after decades of toxic relationships with men, where she would sacrifice anything just to feel a little bit of the acceptance and love that God created her to feel, she found hope in the community that she experienced at Celebrate Recovery right here at Journey. As a result of those relationships and relentless therapy, Lauren has found the truth about who she is. She is not unworthy. She is not bad. She is not useless. She is loved, wanted, and accepted. The enemy had his grip tight on her heart. But as a result of finding Jesus and those people, she is loosening the enemy's grip, and she's finding peace in the grip of Jesus. She's in the most healthy relationship she's had up to this point in her life. She's married and has a beautiful young boy that they dedicated to raise to know Jesus on our platform just 1 year ago. It's amazing. But here's the thing that I want you to know. The names that you answer to matter to God. Let me say that again. The names you answer to matter to God. Lauren learned to answer to dirty and useless and miserable. I learned to answer to goober. God doesn't want us to land in a place where we answer to those names, either when we look up or when we feel like that's who we are. Our name, who we are, matters to God. It mattered to God that he came to change Abram to Abraham. He told Gideon that he was a mighty warrior. He told David he was a man after God's own heart. Those things matter to God. He wants us to identify with a much more profound thing. Here's the truth. God wants to finish what he's already started in you. In Philippians 1:6, it says this, "Be confident of this, that he who created, who started, or began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it until the day of Jesus Christ." It matters that God is the story that he started in you. God is faithful to complete in you. There will be a point on the other side of the story when God brings the story that he's telling now to a full and complete conclusion. In fact, in a lot of ways, that's what the book of Revelation does for us. It tells us how God's going to put the capstone on the story that he's telling right now. In fact, there's this one verse I want to bring up to you and just kind of lay out for us to really understand today. It's Revelation chapter 2, and it's in verse 17. And it's just this part of this one verse where God tells us what's going to happen when he brings that story to completion on the other side. He says this, "To everyone who is victorious, I will give some of the manna that has been hidden away in heaven. And I will give to each one a white stone, and on a stone will be engraved a new name that no one understands except the one who receives it." He makes three promises to us. We are in this story now, but when he brings this story to completion, when he finishes the work that he started in us, that he's going to transition and give us three fully realized promises. The first one is God's hidden manna. Now, you may be familiar with the story of the Israelite army, the Israelites, when they were released from captivity in Egypt, and they were, by their own sin, caused to have to stay outside of the promised land for 40 years. But every single day in those 40 years, God fed them with manna from heaven. It was God's provision for them. The story that God started then in them is that there's a constant provision that God will provide. And there will be a day when all of this is over, when the victorious will see the entire promise of God, and they will be given this hidden manna that is the perfect protection, this perfect provision from God that's going to happen. The first promise is that you'll be given the hidden manna, this perfect provision from God. The second promise is a white stone. I don't know if you, but getting a white rock isn't all that important to me. Like, I don't know why I'd need a white rock. There's all kinds of much prettier rocks. Diamonds are nice colored rocks, right? I'd like to have a big diamond with my name on it. But what's significant about a white stone is that white is this communication of perfection, of righteousness. I don't know about you, but I don't feel righteous. So when God is saying, I'm giving you my righteousness, the stability, a stone, of this righteousness in your life, that when God completes this story that he's telling, when he's being faithful to us and finishes this story that he's telling in our lives, we need to understand that God has a plan to perfect his acceptance of us. I don't know about you, but I don't feel righteous. I don't feel holy. I don't feel like I deserve a white stone. But God says, when I finish the work that I've started in you, I'll give you some of the hidden manna. I will perfect my provision for you. I'll give you a white stone, and I will perfect my acceptance of you. And then there's this third part. where he says, on that white stone will be engraved a name, a new name for the person. For me, I'll get a white stone with a new name that only I will understand. That's something that is the perfection of intimacy with God. That there's this word that he'll use to describe me that only I will fully and completely understand. You know what's crazy about God's love for us is that it begins with us being completely broken and him being completely holy. And he loves us exactly where we are. But he loves us enough not to leave us there. So he begins to work in us on this journey of making us more like him and helping us walk with him and affirming and loving us towards something better. And he'll complete that one day by giving you and me a name that only we know, a name that resounds so deeply inside of us that it fulfills all of the things that we've always wanted to be known by. It'll replace things like loser. It'll replace things like useless, broken. It'll replace things like goober. And it will make us whole in perfected intimacy with God. God spends a lot of time in the Bible telling us who we are. It's almost as if he knew that we would doubt who that was from time to time. It's as if he saw it coming, that we'd spend our whole lives searching for what our identity, what our real name was, and that there'd be many moments in our lives when we let different kinds of names define us. When we've looked in our mirror, compared ourselves to pictures and heard the name ugly. When we've been left by loved ones, people we trusted once, and heard the name unworthy. When we've been drowning in discouragement, living in a seemingly never-ending crisis, and heard the name forgotten. When we've had our hopes up and our hearts open, only to be brought down by closed doors, and we've heard rejected. When we looked for infinite, affirming love through lesser, physical, fleshly versions, and we'd give it away. Or when it was stolen, and we'd hear impure, we'd hear garbage. When we go to other vices to ease our pain, and we hear addict, we hear forever broken. When we feel like we're living in the shadow of someone else's calling, and we hear second place. When our pain cripples us to the point where we don't even know how to let others in, and we hear lonely. When our past seems too gross for others to forgive, and we hear disgusting, it's overwhelming. These voices we're constantly hearing, it's suffocating. This air of constant critique and comparing, and it's sort of amazing. The people whose we've allowed to let a name us. The power I've given to my past, to my mirror, and to my surroundings, and enabled them to identify me. The amount of years I've spent living up to whatever others say over me. But God says something else about me. It's like he knew there would be other voices. So he wrote his voice down in a timeless book of truths that would remind us over and over again in the moments when lives would block out truth and somehow make us forget. I'm going back to the source, not to the people I've allowed to represent God to me, but to the actual, literal, tangible words that he's written down for me. And there are some other names he's given to me. John 15:15, he calls me friend. 1 Thessalonians 1:4, he calls me chosen. Ephesians 2:10, he calls me his workmanship. He calls me his art. He calls me handmade. He calls me purposed and fashioned for good things. 1 Corinthians 6:19, he calls my body a temple. He calls it the residence of the Holy Spirit. Acts 1:8, he calls me his messenger to the world. Galatians 3:26, he calls me his child. Romans 5:8, he calls me greatly loved. John 8:36, he calls me free, free indeed. 2 Corinthians 5:17, he calls me brand new. And it's amazing how different these names are from the names I'm used to listening to. And in my journey to rediscover who I am, in my battle to uncover the truths of myself, I've learned something new about my name. And now, this is what I am certain of. My name is not the name the world calls me. My name is not the name my past calls me. My name is not even the name my own mirror calls me, but my name My name is the name I answer to, and I can choose today, from this moment forward, to answer to a new name. When I hear lonely, that's not me. When I hear disgusting, that's not me. When I hear unworthy, I don't even look over my shoulder. When I hear broken, they must have confused me. Please look somewhere else. When I hear ugly, abandoned, useless, forgotten, I figure someone just has to remind them that these may have been my old names, but they're no longer the names that I respond to. My name is the name I've chosen to spend my days living up to. And that if these other voices are not saying the same thing, that the truth is, I look in my mirror and I repeat this: they have no right to be speaking to you. When you stop answering to your old names, they stop having power over you. The names that my Father, eternity's author, the world's creator, have called me are the only names I answer to. When I hear friend of God, that's my name. God's workmanship, that's my name. God chosen, that's my name. Loved, wanted, created with a purpose, that's my name. God's temple, that's my name. God's messenger, that's my name. Free, that's my name. Child of God, you must be looking for me. Greatly loved, you must be calling for me. Brand new, that is my name. And that is the name that I respond to. The enemy has no power here. Perfect love casts out fear, and perfect love has named me and you. So what is your new name? What is stirring up inside of you when you hear these words that his word, that the word has proclaimed? What do you know is the name that God is calling you? Maybe it's not the name you grew up with. Maybe it's not the name your old friends associate you with. Maybe it's not the name that you spent your whole life identifying with, but it's the name that you now answer to. So when the enemy tries to get to you, it's the name you introduce yourself with. As for me, my name is forgiven. My name is free. My name is brand new, loved, wanted, child of God, created with a purpose. And it's been a pleasure to meet you.